No one who has heard the case but must believe that you were engaged in baby farming in its worst aspect. Houses in which you lived testify with that ghastly evidence of these bodies that you were carrying on this nefarious, this hellish business of destroying the lives of these infants for the sake of gain. In this episode, we are heading into the inner suburbs of Sydney in the 1890s as we hear about the barbaric crimes of John and Sarah Makin. They were baby farmers and baby murderers. They conned poor mothers, and when they were finally arrested, police dug up the bodies of 15 infants in the backyards of their past residences. Welcome to Ratbags and Roustabouts, the place where we tell those extraordinary stories of ordinary people who never made it to the history books. I'm your host, Marian Langford. For anyone out there who likes true crime, this story is a doozy. However, just be warned that this is all about the murder of babies. So if that doesn't sound like something you really want to hear about, maybe check out one of the other past episodes of Ratbags. I actually came across this tale years ago when I used to live in Sydney because I actually lived around the corner from the former Makin house, which is now in a pretty fashionable part of the inner west. But this wasn't always the case. So let's get into it and head back to 1890s Sydney as we hear about the cruel and heartless exploits of baby farmers and multiple murderers, John and Sarah Makin. On October 13, 1892, this paragraph appeared in the Sydney Morning Herald. Yesterday morning, a shocking discovery was made in the yard of a house in Macdonaldtown. 2 drainpipe layers were digging a trench in the yard for the purpose of connecting the house by service pipes with the sewer when they came across the remains of 2 babies. Both bodies were buried about 2 feet from the surface and decomposition was far advanced. The matter was immediately reported to the police, who conveyed the remains to the South Sydney morgue where Dr. Payton, the government medical officer, made an autopsy. 2 plainclothes police officers were put on the case, but so far their discoveries have been of little account. An inquest will be opened this morning, but an adjournment will be asked for to enable the police to pursue their inquiries. What police didn't know at that point was that this was just the tip of the iceberg. Those 2 workers had stumbled on a terrible secret that had been taking place in the household of John and Sarah Makin. And soon, many, many more babies would be dug up in backyards all over the inner suburbs of Sydney. While the records don't all agree on the figures, at least 15 bodies were dug up by investigators. But before any of that, let's meet the Makins. John Makin was born on Valentine's Day, 1845 in Dapto, south of Sydney, the son of a convict. He'd previously worked as a drayman for a brewer, basically transporting the beer, as well as a trolley driver. Meanwhile, Sarah Makin was born Sarah Sutcliffe in Sussex Street, Sydney in 1845. Her father had been a convict too. She'd previously been married and had a daughter, but her young husband had essentially drunk himself to death in 1871. She married John Makin later that same year, and they went on to have 10 children together. Anyway, in the intervening years, it seems at some point John suffered an accident somehow and was unable to work. So by around 1890, to get money, the pair became baby farmers. I mean, I guess you could call it a profession, but even the term baby farming was created more as an insult than anything else. Essentially, in those days, there was no legislation around adoption, so people would make their own private arrangements. It was a time when there weren't a lot of options for contraception, but equally having a child out of wedlock was something that was shunned by society. And let's add into the mix the economic depression that was going on in Australia in 1892-93. So if a woman ended up in the situation where she'd given birth to an illegitimate baby with no money to care for it, she might put an ad in a journal or newspaper for a kind person who could raise the child. For this, the woman would either make a one-off payment, so kind of like a backyard adoption, or she'd pay a weekly sum for the upkeep of the child. This was essentially a type of private foster care arrangement. She might visit the child, she might take it back if her circumstances improved, but then that wasn't all that likely since she was probably handing over half her income for the upkeep of the child. The ads might go something like this: wanted kind person to adopt baby girl for life, premium £5. Or if there were ongoing payments, it might say, wanted kind person to take charge of baby, apply stating terms. But baby farmers, essentially people who made their living out of taking these children in, were rarely kind. They were, in fact, notorious for ill-treating the infants. In the case of being paid a lump sum for essentially a private adoption, financially, it was in the baby farmer's interest that the child didn't live too long. And of course, with the care arrangements that saw weekly sums paid, it was easy enough to give excuses should the mother want to come for a visit. The child was sick, the child was asleep, was somewhere else, so on, so on. Baby farmers would take in a large number of children for the money and then neglect or abuse them. Or they would kill them, but continue to collect the cash. Plus, with the high child mortality rate, if a baby died, not many questions were actually asked. It's not really a surprise then that many of the women who've been executed in Britain, Australia and New Zealand were sentenced to death for infanticide. In fact, only one woman was ever executed in New Zealand, Minnie Dean, and that was for killing babies in her care as a baby farmer. In England in 1872, the Infant Life Protection Act had been passed to try to regulate the industry. An investigation into baby farming in the Times in 1870 had said this: "My conviction is that children are murdered in scores by these women, that adoption is only a fine phrase for slow or sudden death." Baby farming was actually one of the things that led to legislation being introduced for adoption to try to legalise and regulate it. In New South Wales in July 1892, the Children's Protection Act was passed with the hopes of doing just that, but it proved to be fairly ineffective, and certainly in the Makins' case, it didn't stop any of their activities. So let's get back to Burren Street and start digging a little deeper. That's what the police were doing. When those two pipe layers had dug up the first body, they initially thought it was the remains of a cat. But when they found the second, they realised both bodies were human children. The police came and began an extensive search of the backyard. Buried at different depths, but in a neat row, with the same spacing in between, they found another 5 babies. They were in different states of decomposition, so it was difficult to determine cause of death. In an article in the Australian Star, it described the scene. One of the bodies found yesterday was more than 2 foot under the surface, so that the digging work was of a severe nature owing to the clayey nature of the soil and the fact that it was saturated with the recent rains. The stench from the decomposing bodies was dreadful, and even now, after their removal, the smell from the yard is of a very offensive nature. The suburb of Macdonaldtown doesn't exist anymore, but Burren Street certainly does. It's now part of Erskineville, a small suburb just down the hill from Newtown in Sydney's inner west. The last remaining link back to the name Macdonaldtown is Macdonaldtown train station, which is right there in the middle of Burren Street. It's a sought-after area, just 4 kilometres from the city centre. Homes around there sell in the millions nowadays. Most of the houses date from around 1890. It's been gentrified now, but its history is a seedy one. It was a working-class suburb. Many of the residents worked at the brickworks down the road. Others were market gardeners or tanners. Around the corner was a pub that would sell sly grog. Dunny lanes still thread their way through the backs of the terrace houses. now places to keep wheelie bins and the home of colonies of rats. The houses were and still are either 12 feet wide, that's 3.6 metres, or 14 feet wide, that's 4.3 metres. It's rare to get anything bigger. The Burren Street house was a 2-storey terrace house with 5 rooms in all and a long narrow backyard. The Makins weren't living there when the bodies were found. By then, they were in Wells Street, Redfern. In fact, they had only lived in the Burren Street house for about 7 weeks. They'd paid 4 weeks' rent up front, with John Makin boasting to neighbours that he had an inheritance from his mother so didn't need to work. Yet, the landlord never saw any more rent money. When they were arrested, the landlord was hounding the Makins for the rest of the cash they owed. For the 7 weeks they lived at the house, neighbours said John Makin was often seen sitting on the front porch not doing much. Sarah, on the other hand, was hardly ever seen, hiding away inside the house. They had moved in one evening between 7 and 8 p.m, with John refusing the offer of help from the next-door neighbour as he ferried boxes inside. He did, however, borrow a pick from them for some gardening work they intended to do. The same next-door neighbours also swore that they heard a baby crying that first night. When the 7 babies' remains were found, suspicion quickly fell on the Makin family, and police began going back through their old residences from the previous 2 years. It seemed the Makins moved often. But the next baby's body to be found by police was buried on a vacant lot in Zamia Street, Redfern. They went to see the Makins at their current Wells Street address and discovered recently dug earth in the backyard there, but with no body. So they deduced that the Makins had dug up the body and reinterred it at the vacant lot in Zamia Street. Then, at 109 George Street, Redfern, police found 4 more children's bodies. At Alderson Street, Redfern, 1 baby was found, and at 28 Levy Street, Chippendale, 2 babies' bodies were found. All in all, the police had the bodies of 15 children of varying ages, but all of them under about 6 months of age. John and Sarah Makin were arrested, along with their 2 daughters, Blanche, who was 18, and Florence, who was 17. So the Makins had 10 children in all, 5 boys and 5 girls, and of course Sarah had a daughter from her previous marriage. That daughter had previously fought with Sarah, so the 2 were apparently estranged. At the time of their arrest, they only had 4 children living at home. That was Blanche and Florence, as well as a 2-year-old son, Cecil, and a 10 or 11-year-old daughter, Daisy. 2 of their sons were living in Wollongong, and they had another 16-year-old daughter, Clarice, or Clary, who had moved out of the family home in July 1892 to work as a domestic servant. Anyway, the 4 arrests were big news in the area, according to this from the Australian Star. Great excitement prevailed in the vicinity of the Newtown Police Court this morning, where it was known that the 4 persons in custody in connection with the discovery of remains of infants at Macdonaldtown would be brought before the magistrate. People had assembled from near and far to get a glimpse of the accused. But the accommodation in the court being inadequate, numbers suffered disappointment by having to remain outside. The spectators in court were a miscellaneous throng consisting of people of all shades of occupations and manner of dress, from the workman in his shirt sleeves to the well-dressed gentleman. But the crowds didn't see very much that day. The 4 accused were led into the courtroom from a subterranean staircase, John Makin with a determined expression on his face. The 2 girls, according to the article, seemed to feel the gravity of the situation. John and Sarah were accused of causing the death of the infant daughter of Edward Bothamley and Minnie Davis around the end of July or beginning of August. The 2 teenage girls were accused of being concerned in the death of the baby. Bail was asked for and quickly refused, and the 4 were led away back down the staircase. Investigators never did manage to identify all the babies, but these are some that we do know about. Let's start with that first murder the Makins were accused of. Mignonette Davis, known in the court case as Baby Number 4, was the illegitimate daughter of Minnie Davis and Edward or Horace Bothamley. Minnie Davis was a domestic servant in Petersham and gave birth to her daughter on June 10, 1892. On June 21st, she put an ad in the Sydney Morning Herald for a kind person to care for her child. This was not a private adoption, but more of a foster care arrangement. John Makin answered the ad, giving a false name, and they agreed to a term of 10 shillings a week for the Makins to look after Mignonette. Minnie Davis was free to visit the child whenever she liked, and she later testified to say she used to go every Saturday to see her child and pay the week's fees. When this arrangement was first made, the Makins were in George Street, Redfern, but the second time Minnie and Horace went to visit their daughter, the Makins had moved to Burren Street. During one of these visits, Minnie and Horace discovered the Makins' real surname when they saw it on a card of Sarah's that was advertising midwifery services. When they first visited, the baby seemed in good health, but when Mignonette was about 6 weeks old, the Makins told Minnie and Horace that she had a cold. They'd had to take her to a doctor, and so Minnie handed over the 2 shillings 6pence for the doctor's fees. The next time Minnie and Horace visited, their daughter's cold was worse, and on August 4th, John Makin sent Minnie a telegram telling her that Mignonette was dead. The Makins offered to take care of the burial for a price. Minnie and Horace took a bunch of flowers to the Burren Street house and asked to see their child. John brought her downstairs, laid out on a board, dressed in a long white gown which covered her body, with flowers around her. John Makin said to Horace at that time, perhaps it was better it had died. But no proper burial took place, of course. The Makins pocketed the £2 Minnie had given them and instead buried Mignonette in the backyard at Burren Street. And later, when police examined the remains of Mignonette, it was clear that she'd been starved to death. During the court case, items of clothing that were submitted as evidence lined the courtroom. The stench was at times too much to bear. The Australian Star said this: "At this point, the smell arising from the clothes found round the various remains became overpowering. These clothes are ranged along the wall the whole length of the court, for which there is absolutely no necessity. Witnesses, of course, are asked to identify portions of them, but it would be far better if the clothes were kept in a separate room and sent for when required." Another baby adopted by the Makins was Charles Ward. He was born on February 12, 1892, to 19-year-old domestic servant Agnes Ward. On April 27, she put an ad in the Evening News for a kind lady to adopt him. John and Sarah, along with their daughter Daisy, met with Agnes and agreed to adopt the boy for £5. They promised to be very kind to the baby boy, with John Makin even claiming that it would fill the gap left by the death of their own son, Johnny. Charles would be able to take the dead child's place. They told her they would soon be moving to a piggery and would send Agnes the address. She was welcome to visit any time she liked. But the address was never sent, and Agnes never saw her son again. The 4 babies found at 109 George Street, Redfern, were labelled A, B, C and D. Police believe the child C was Charles Ward. Another domestic servant, Clara Risby, gave birth to a daughter on April 15, 1892. A couple of weeks later, she put an ad in the Evening News, again for a kind person to adopt her daughter, offering £5. This time the Makins called themselves the McLaughlins, with Sarah telling Clara that she would raise the girl as one of her own. And this time it wasn't a piggery they were moving to. They said they were soon to take over a poultry farm at Rockdale, and they promised to send their new address. Clara visited the baby on May 18, but when she visited again, she was told Mrs. McLaughlin was out with the baby. The next time she went to the house, it was empty. During the trial, the prosecution produced a witness who was a local pawnbroker. He testified that John Makin, who he knew as Mason, had pawned some baby's clothes. One was a shirt with a turkey twill border. Clara recognised it straight away. She had sewed it herself for her baby. It turned out that the Makins were long-standing customers at the pawn shop. They always pawned baby clothes. Once, some clothes taken there by Daisy Makin contained 9 baby gowns in one parcel. 2 days after Clara Risby's daughter was born, another domestic servant, Mary Stacey, gave birth to her baby girl. Like Clara, she also advertised for someone to adopt her infant, and the Makins, this time under the alias Ray, offered to take the child for £3. This was the letter sent from Sarah Makin to Mary. I will take your little baby for life at a small sum of £3 or £3.10 or whatever terms we may come to. It is not for the sake of the money, but just to give the child an outfit. You need never trouble about your baby's welfare. She will have every attention and the love of a kind mother. We are on the eve of going to the suburbs on a poultry farm to a fine, healthy part, so if you will come down, we will explain things and make arrangements. Mary went to see if this Ray family was acceptable. The family made a big show of having taken a great fancy to the baby, kissing it and fawning over it. When she later agreed to hand the baby to them, the price agreed was £2 for the baby and £2 for clothing. At the time she gave them her daughter, she was a strong, healthy baby. But later, when John Makin and his teenage daughter Blanche took the baby to Mary for a visit, she was restless, crying, and looked like there was something up. Mary said maybe she needs changing and took the child into the house to change her. That's when she found that the baby seemed quite hollow and empty and thin. She told the Makins, who said that there was a bottle of milk in the baby's basket. Mary took the bottle and tasted the milk. She said it was cold, and John Makin answered he didn't realise it was. Mary took the milk inside to warm it, and that's when she realised it had been watered down. Her testimony on this in court was just heartbreaking. She kept breaking down in tears. It was clear she loved her child, and it was just the circumstances of life that had forced her to hand her baby over. John Makin began talking about how the family was moving to a poultry farm in Hurstville, and he was going to buy a cow, and then there'd be plenty of milk for the baby and it would all be fine. Mary never saw her daughter again. Just like Clara, when Mary tried visiting her child, the George Street house was empty. She spent 2 days hunting through Hurstville for the family, but the search was fruitless. This was the report in the evening news. The witness became convulsed in sobs and on recovering her composure said she interviewed all the bakers, grocers and butchers in Hurstville, but nobody seemed to know anything of them. The witness made further inquiries about Redfern for the Rays, but to no avail. She then communicated with the Redfern police and told them she suspected something was wrong. The constable in the station told the witness that inquiries would be made and she would be communicated with, but she did not hear anything, and then gave up all hopes of ever hearing of her baby again. Agnes Todd was yet another domestic servant with a startlingly similar story about her daughter Elsie, who was born in December 1891. But it was the case of Horace Murray that the Makins would eventually be convicted over. Horace was born on May 30, 1892 to 18-year-old Amber Murray. About 4 weeks later, she put an ad in the Sydney Morning Herald for a motherly person to adopt her boy for a small payment. This time using the name Hill, the Makins answered the ad, offering to take the boy for £3. When the groups met at the Makins' George Street house, they told Amber Murray they had lost a son of their own and they would raise him as their own. Amber handed over the £3 and her baby, and John Makin at this point even made a blunder by signing some adoption papers with the wrong alias. He signed John Leslie before scratching it out and writing Hill. Again, like so many others, it was the last time Amber ever saw her baby son. A day or two later, the Makins moved to Burren Street, but Horace didn't. He was later identified as baby D, found in the backyard at 109 George Street, Redfern. The poor thing hadn't lasted more than a day before the Makins killed him. But it was Horace Murray and Mignonette Davis who would eventually be the Makins' undoing. Those were the two deaths for which the Makins were, in the end, found guilty of manslaughter. During the court case, as well as witness testimony from the mothers of the children, the Makins' own children gave evidence against them. Clary testified that she had seen some of the articles of clothing that formed the macabre decoration in the courtroom in the Burren Street house, to which her mother declared as the court broke for lunch that she was swearing all lies. When the four defendants were led back in after the break, Sarah raised her hands towards the spot where Clary was standing and said loudly, "May the curse of the Almighty rest upon my child." When they then brought in 11-year-old Daisy to testify, she was sobbing so violently that Sarah tried to break from where she was being held and run across the courtroom to console her daughter. Soon everyone was in tears. Sarah Makin, Daisy, half the jurors. The one person who wasn't crying? In fact, he showed no sign of emotion at all, was John Makin. But in the end it caused such a commotion that they had to postpone Daisy's examination. Daisy had lived with the family when they were at Burren Street, but she seemed to move between the family home and an older married sister's home. In the end, her evidence wasn't particularly damning or substantial. The defence, however, did object to such a young child being forced to give evidence against her own parents. But it was evidence from someone unrelated to the family that was really the nail in the coffin. It seemed John Makin didn't keep his mouth shut while he was being held. He told his cellmate things, which the cellmate then testified to in court. According to the cellmate's evidence, Makin told him that he had buried the babies and that his daughters were innocent. He also mentioned something about the use of chloroform, but no trace of poison was ever detected in any of the babies' bodies during examination. That said, it's likely that chloroform wouldn't be able to be traced in a skeleton. In fact, though, no sign of how they died, apart from possible starvation, was ever definitely determined. A wrap-up in the South Australian Chronicle said this: 15 little corpses dug up from backyards bore mute witness at the bar of public opinion, though by the devilish cunning and cruelty combined of the guilty pair, there were neither traces of poison nor violence revealed. In their callous brutality, the husband and wife sought to protect themselves by allowing their hopeless charges to linger longer and suffer more. In secrecy and silence, they watched the flickering spark expire, which it did not pay them to keep alive, and then shovelled the tiny telltale body into a hole as if it were that of a cat or dog. On such miscreants, compassion is entirely wasted. But was John Makin telling the truth when he made his brief confession to his fellow prisoner? It had the effect of clearing Blanche and Florence at a time when it was virtually impossible for him and Sarah to escape a guilty verdict. And throughout the police investigation and the trial, he had remained tight-lipped, silent. When the whole court had been in tears as Daisy took the stand, he remained unmoved. In fact, one article in the Australian Star said this about him: Makin's extreme coolness noticed during the protracted coronial inquiry remained one of the prominent features of the man's character up to the last. When arrested, he said little to the officers at any time, and his mind was entirely fixed on the one intention that whatever evidence they should be in a position to bring against him, they would have to find out for themselves. So why would he then shoot his mouth off to his cellmate? The same article put much of the blame squarely at Sarah Makin's feet. It said John was under the magnetic influence of the strong will and temper of his wife. It also said Sarah Makin was the boss and talked about John's silence and Sarah's chatter in court as being the bulk of the talk was mostly on the woman's part, which is usually described as nagging. But not all newspapers shared that opinion. The Port Macquarie News said this: There was no redeeming feature to awaken sympathy for John Makin. The murder of helpless infants had with him become a trade. Brutal, callous and indolent, he regarded child murder as an easy way of getting his living and saw in their miserable deaths but so much gain. His marriage may have been, as his relatives assert, the bad turn in his life, but no man becomes a murderer in a step. In any case, John and Sarah Makin were found guilty, with the jury recommending mercy for Sarah. John was sentenced to hang. Sarah's sentence of execution was commuted to life imprisonment. The two teenage girls were released. Even then, as the verdict was read and their fates were sealed, Sarah cried while John tried to calm her. As they were led from the courtroom, Sarah pointed the finger directly at the daughter who had testified against them. She yelled, "Clary! It was Clary that did it." When reading his sentence, Justice Stevens said this about Horace Murray: "You took money from the mother of this child. You beguiled her with promises which you never meant to perform and which you never did perform, having determined on the death of the child. You deceived her as to your address, and you endeavoured to make it utterly fruitless that any search should be made. And finally, in order to make detection impossible, as you thought, having bereft it of life, you buried this child in your yard as you would the carcass of a dog. No one who has heard the case but must believe that you are engaged in baby farming in its worst aspect. Houses in which you lived testify with that ghastly evidence of these bodies that you were carrying on this nefarious, this hellish business of destroying the lives of these infants for the sake of gain." John Makin did appeal, but to no avail. The judgment held, and on August 15th, 1893, he was hanged at Darlinghurst Jail. Unlike others who confessed all when faced by the hangman, Makin left 2 letters, one declaring his innocence, the other saying farewell to his children. Sarah spent her years in prison working as a hospital attendant at the jail. Her health deteriorated, and after appeals from both Florence and Minnie, her daughter from her first marriage, in 1911 she was released to spend her last days with her family. She moved in with Florence and her family, and 7 years later, in 1918, she died of heart failure, aged 72. In looking back at the case, the Sydney Morning Herald said crimes such as these committed by the Makins would continue to happen until the bigger issue of the shame surrounding illegitimacy was addressed in society. The lesson of Makin's life and death will not be complete if it ends with merely teaching that punishment is the necessary sequel of crime. The causes that created his ghastly calling are still at work, and though his fate may deter others from engaging in the business on such a scale of magnitude or with such a disregard of consequences, it is too much to expect that if the demand exists, the supply of such a service will not be forthcoming. To the moral causes at the bottom of it all, we do not refer. But assuming that, as society at present exists, unwelcomed infants will come into life, society imposes a terrible necessity that they should be hidden away in the grave. This is a fact from which society ought not to shrink, for until it is recognised as a fact, no effectual means can be taken that will stay the secret death of infants. It is to avoid the exposure of shame that infants are smothered away, and the more vigilant we are in dragging every case or shame into the public light, the more determined will be the efforts to fly from that publicity. Macdonaldtown ceased to exist on March 27th, 1893, a few months before John Makin was executed. Some said the shame that the case had cast on the suburb had left its residents and the city itself wanting a fresh start. Of course, that isn't true. The two things weren't related at all. But even if that was the plan, it would never have worked. The acts committed by the Makins, the names of the babies whose lives they cut short, they wouldn't be easily forgotten. And that, folks, is the story of John and Sarah Makin, baby farmers, baby murderers, all round not very nice people. I feel like enjoyed is the wrong word, but I do hope you have enjoyed listening to today's episode. Now, with Christmas coming, the next couple of episodes of Ratbags and Roustabouts will be a little bit different, so that I can have a bit of a break and spend some time eating turkey and wrangling children, mainly stopping them from destroying the Christmas tree. The next couple of Ratbags episodes are ones I've pre-recorded. And I've taken the opportunity to mix things up a little bit and go a bit left field with the topics they're on. So they're a bit shorter than my regular episodes and a bit more fun. I mean, they are certainly more fun than hearing about baby killers, but that shouldn't be too hard, hey? And of course, you'll still be learning about history, so you'll have plenty of great anecdotes to entertain others with at all those holiday parties. And I'll be back with my usual programming in the new year. Until then, let me wish you all a very Merry Christmas, if that's your thing, or a Merry Winter Solstice, if you're a Druid, or, a great summer solstice if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. I have a son who thinks that on Christmas Day it's magically going to snow, so he's going to be disappointed. But obviously, if you're itching for even more cool history stories and haven't listened to all of the Ratbags and Roustabouts episodes, check out the back catalogue. You can find them all over at ratbagsandroustabouts.com, where there are also extra little stories to go with each episode, as well as links to the main resources I use in my research. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking now. Make sure you join me in a fortnight's time for my special summer edition of Ratbags, which I've been calling One I Prepared Earlier. Have a great summer or winter break, and I'll be back again in January with more stories about those common as muck ratbags and roustabouts from our past who still have incredible tales to tell.